Okay, we are now moving into section 4 for our lecture today. And the first thing that you need to know about government is that, first of all, God created government. Government is not something that is bad or evil, but God created government to reward goodness and to punish evil. Basically, if you do what's right, then government is on your side, but if you don't, then you're going to be punished by the government. So let's talk about, as a general rule, what government was like in the colonies during the colonial era. So remember, there were 3 types of colonies. There were charter colonies, proprietary colonies, and royal colonies. And each type of colony had a slightly different form of government. So if you lived in a charter colony, the colonists elected all of their leaders. They got to elect their governors, their judges, and their legislature, as long as they were under a charter kind of government. Next, we have proprietary colonies. And remember, the proprietary colony is where the king gives land to a specific person. And proprietary colonies, the proprietor, or the heir of the proprietor, is named the governor, and then they could choose other people to be the governor if they didn't want to be the governor. So that's how charter colonies and proprietary colonies selected their governors. In royal colonies, the king chose the governor. So because the colony was under the direct control of the king, obviously he's going to be the one making the decision for who's going to be the governor. And the governor has lots of powers, has several specific powers. First of all, he can veto laws, or basically say no to laws that have been passed by the legislature, and he has the power to call out the militia. He can also regulate land grants, which means he can decide if someone is allowed to move to a specific location or not. Next important branch of government that we need to talk about is the legislature. Every single colony had a legislature. Every colony had a legislature. Every single colony had a legislature. The important power that the legislature had was the power of the purse. What do you keep in your purse? Money. Remember, I've always told you, money makes the world go round. So here we have the group of people that has the power of the purse, the power to control the money is the legislature. Now, the people who served in the legislature were chosen by the colonists. So the everyday normal citizens had a voice in their government because they got to elect who represented them in the legislature. Most of the time, the people who were permitted to vote were free adult men who owned property, and this normally needed to be white to be able to vote. In New England, church membership was also a requirement for being able to vote. All right, so we've talked about the executive branch of government, which is the governor. We've talked about the legislative branch, or the group that makes the laws and controls the money, and that's the legislature. And so now we need to talk about the courts. The court system was guided by English law, obviously, because most of the colonists were coming over from England, so they're going to base their laws on what they already know, English law. And the people who were in charge of the court system was the justice of the peace. And the justice of the peace was the person who basically acted as a judge. He tried people who were accused of crimes and settled disputes between citizens. The justice of the peace was appointed by the governor. The justice of the peace was appointed by the governor. The justice of the peace was not an elected position, but was appointed by the governor. In the 13 original colonies, we're not the United States yet, trial by jury was an important feature. Just like England had trial by jury, America wanted to be able to have trial by jury today. However, most of the time, the person on trial would know the people who were in the jury because they lived in small communities. But that's just the way things had to be. All right, moving on, we are going to talk about taxes. Taxes are always the way that the government gets the money for it to be able to run. So the main way that taxes were collected in the colonies was based on property tax. Property tax was the primary tax, and it was paid by anybody who owned land or some other valuable property. Property tax was the primary tax. Property tax was the primary tax in the colonies. And sometimes there were poll taxes required also. And that basically means that in order to be able to vote, you had to pay a tax. We don't have this anymore because it actually discriminates voting, because not everyone is going to have the extra money to be able to pay to vote. But that was something that did happen in the colonies. All right, moving on, we'll talk about local governments. So we talked about county governments. Now we're going to get a little bit closer to home and talk about the local governments. Just like we have today, colonies were divided into counties. Our states are divided into counties, so we can trace that all the way back to the colonial times. And the most basic unit of government was the town. And at specific announced times, there were meetings for the freeholders or the freemen, and those would have been the white male property owners. So the freeholders or the freemen were the people who could vote. Now, this is a very specific group of people. You had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to own property. Did this include everybody? No, it did not. Women couldn't be freeholders. Indians couldn't be freeholders. Poor people who didn't own property, they couldn't be freeholders. Slaves couldn't be freeholders. So there's a lot of people who are not included in the ability to govern the country at this point in time. Obviously, eventually we see that changing. So at town meetings, which were the purest form of democracy, local issues were settled, citizens were voted land, night watchmen were appointed, and the needs of the poor were considered. So at town meetings, local issues were settled, citizens were voted land, night watchmen were appointed, and the needs of the poor were taken care of. Pause if you need to as I go through this list one more time. At town meetings, local issues were settled, citizens were voted land, night watchmen were appointed, and the needs of the poor were taken care of. All right. So they didn't have policemen back in the day. They had something called night watchmen, or the rattle watch, because if there was something that they needed to raise an alarm about, they would shake their rattle, and that would help everyone wake up. So their job was to patrol the streets and call out the time and the weather. So sometimes colonial watchmen were called the rattle watch because they had rattles to sound the alarm. Whistles hadn't actually been invented yet. For example, in 1659, the Dutch settlement of Fort Orange, 2 men were appointed to rattle watch. For 1 year, they were expected to begin their rounds at 10 p.m. and continue until 4 a.m. Beside calling out the hour, they were to look for fires, arrest any thieves, and any damage that they might cause while they were doing their job would be covered by a court insurance policy. So if they knocked over somebody's fence, chasing a thief, that would be covered by their insurance policy. All right, last thing we need to talk about is poor relief. So the poor were assisted in 2 different ways. The first way is around the town, and second is putting out. So around the town, the poor person would live with a different family for a few weeks per family, and then they would change from family to family. And in putting out, a single family would host the poor family, and then the town would give that family additional assistance to help assist, since they were assisting that poor family. Lazy people were not tolerated. Anyone who was lazy could be whipped out of the town, or they could be forced to become an indentured servant. So you weren't wanting to be labeled as being a poor person. Oh, well, take that back. You wouldn't want to be labeled as being a lazy person, because that wasn't tolerated. All right, that is the end of Chapter 3's lecture. So now you have a workbook page to go through, and you'll be learning more about Mary Rowlandson, which was the lady that I mentioned to you on Tuesday, who was captured by the Indians during King Philip's War.